Okay, welcome all to this new lecture with which we will kick off the second half of this lecture program in this new year 2025. A special year because we have something to celebrate. Indeed, as you can also see in the yellow 7-pointed star on our lecture posters, this year marks the 150th anniversary of the tremendous impulse of wisdom into the world. And Madame H.P. Blavatsky was the channel or instrument for this spiritual impulse from the hierarchy of compassion. And of course, what that hierarchy is, we will go into that in much greater detail this evening. Although H.P. Blavatsky's name in particular is attached to it, it was in fact this hierarchy of compassion that made her found the Theosophical Society in 1875. Now a century and a half ago, started in New York at the time. And it was the beginning of the modern Theosophical movement, which continues to resonate and will continue to resonate through the work of Theosophists worldwide. That impulse in 1875 did not come overnight. It fit into a pattern of cyclical spiritual impulses. And the significance of this impulse is still quite underestimated. It revealed wisdom that had been hidden for thousands of years before. Wisdom that offers solutions to all the problems in our lives and in this world. Wisdom with which each one can accelerate his evolution and that of his fellow men. With this you can protect your fellow men and yourself from many pitfalls and thus save much suffering. Wisdom that therefore deserves much more attention in today's world, we think. So that is why we devote the entire second half of this year's program to this impulse, starting therefore at the source, the hierarchy of compassion. A collaboration that is active worldwide, in fact even more than worldwide and in all times. And we describe in this lecture the work of this hierarchy of compassion up to the impulse of 1875 with the arrival of H.P. Blavatsky. And in the coming series we will build on this. In the second half of our season we will present, as you see, weekly lectures including a 30-minute study time after each lecture. Only the study will be private via Zoom. And the lectures are, as you are used from us, broadcast via YouTube. So the study can only be followed through Zoom because of privacy reasons. And if you have not yet subscribed for the study, you can still do that by sending an email to info@blavatskyhouse.org. I will come back to this later. There's a short break right after the lecture for you to do this if you still haven't. Before I begin this lecture, we'd like to offer you a brief glimpse of what will be presented in the months to come. Just to check, is my screen shared? Can you see the... Yes? Okay, good. All right. In March, following this month, Johanna Vermeulen will discuss further the task and place of H.P. Blavatsky in the hierarchy of compassion. And there's a lot to tell about that. First of all, who H.P. Blavatsky actually was, a true mystery. And of course, we will also go into her work. Next, several speakers will discuss all kinds of transformations in the world mentality that arose around H.P. Blavatsky's work. They are examples of how the impulse of wisdom took shape in ideals that have since been increasingly realized in, amongst others, the areas of human rights, peace, freedom of thought, and conscience. But also in the field of religious and philosophical exchange between East and West, in the field of scientific knowledge and development, and last but not least, that impulse of wisdom has of course had its impact in the daily lives of countless of people. Examples abound, so hence we dedicate the 2 months of April and May to this theme of the transformation of the world mentality. We then conclude this program at the end of May with a look to the future. As indicated, impulses come in cycles. For example, H.P. Blavatsky's impulse fit into the Messianic cycle of 2160 years. An impulse that can therefore continue to work for at least 2000 years into the future. So in this last lecture series, we will tell you how everyone can resonate with this impulse and pass it on to future generations of which we ourselves also will one day be a part. Okay, I've now told something about the 150 years. But then what exactly is this Theosophy and how does it relate to the Theosophia that has existed for 18 millions of years? What is Theosophy? First of all, it is a name. And it is important not to hold the name for the thing in itself. A name only refers to something. And that becomes immediately clear when you look at the meaning of the name Theosophy, which comes from the Greek Theosophia, which literally means divine wisdom or the wisdom of gods. It's also called the ancient wisdom or esoteric philosophy, the secret doctrine or the wisdom tradition. And it's also known by many different names in different traditions from east to west. So Theosophia is not just a movement, a new philosophy or a religion. It refers to wisdom that has always been and always will be there. Now, what is wisdom? You could say in short the knowledge of truth. For what is not true cannot be wise. Now that raises the follow-up question, what is truth? You can say the reality that we experience daily, that we see around us. But that is only a very small, limited cross-section of reality. Because reality in all its facets is infinite, boundless. And every time we discover new ways of perceiving, in the big and in the small, we see how infinite that reality is. And that also implies the possibility of continuing to explore that reality infinitely, and thus developing boundless wisdom. Now, our human powers of perception are limited. Even between people, what we see is not what another sees. So what we perceive and understand of that reality depends on our powers of perception, our own consciousness, and also the degree to which we are connected to the consciousness of others. The Buddha explained this beautifully using the parable of the blind monks and the elephant. It says that every sincere and verifiable perception offers only one facet of infinite reality. The perception of the blind monk who holds the elephant's tail and claims to be holding a piece of rope has value just like that of another monk who says he holds a snake when he gropes its trunk, or a third monk who perceives a tree feeling the elephant's leg. If you want to find a wider truth, it helps not to fight the truth of the various perspectives, but to share, to explore, and to combine them. And ultimately, if you want a truly broader picture, you will have to train yourself to develop new senses that allow you to perceive reality in a wider perspective. In short, reality is that with which the observer identifies. Or else reality is what the perceiver holds true, the illusory part of which he has not yet seen through. Like the blind monk who holds the elephant's tail and claims it is a piece of rope. Now, by definition, there cannot be only one overarching truth. Because if two views of truth are in conflict with each other, either one is true or the other, or they can be unified into a larger view of reality. And so, we experience that our view of reality can expand daily. And that we can accelerate that by sharing, by exploring, by integrating knowledge and wisdom with each other. And that reality can be seen, you could say, as an infinitely large elephant, if we use the imagery of the Buddhist story. Now, these kinds of parables, like for example, this parable or Plato's allegory of the cave, They point to our tendency to hold limited things to be true. But at the same time, these stories point to a way to arrive at more truth as we expand our ability to perceive. So how much we know of reality also depends on our own powers of perception, the degree of our own consciousness, and the extent to which we are also connected to the consciousness of others. And this again relates to the literal meaning of Theosophia. Divine wisdom, wisdom of the gods. We discussed the meaning of wisdom as the degree of perceiving reality. But what is divine? What are gods? They are beings, living beings, whose perception, whose consciousness is beyond the human level of consciousness. As simple as that. Just as reality is limitless, so are the levels of consciousness. And levels of consciousness that are beyond the human, well, beyond the level of consciousness of the average human being as he is now, at this stage of evolution, can be also called divine. Now, divine, God, and gods have become somewhat loaded terms. In other traditions, they speak of heavenly Buddhas, the Anichoans, the ancestors, angels, etc. For us, the wisdom of these advanced beings is eternal, ever valid, universal. You could also call it universal wisdom. And this then is the distinction we make between Theosophy and Theosophia. Theosophia refers to the, for us, eternal knowledge about the one underlying spiritual reality. It is universal wisdom, so it has always been there, will always be there, and can also be found worldwide and in all times. Now, does it mean that we should just accept this blindly then? No, because it is not really your wisdom until you have proven it for yourself, experienced it for yourself. The beings we call divine or universal are ahead of us because they have awakened the divine or universal in themselves. They have expanded their own consciousness and powers of perception a great deal further than we, and in this way have gained experience in many more areas than we do now. But even though in our evolution we are not yet what we can call divine or universal, every human being, indeed every being, does have this universal or divine latent in him, as we shall explain further. So Theosophia is essentially boundless, infinite, and Theosophy, with a Y, is what has been made public under that name since 1875. And if it's right, it is as much as possible a representation of a piece of that infinite Theosophia. So it is not just another philosophical movement like, say, Hinduism, Buddhism, Platonism, Christianity, or humanism. It is a teaching that refers to the same source from which all these different religious and philosophical movements and traditions also originated. And the challenge is to keep and transmit that theosophy as pure as possible, so that it deviates as little as possible from its source, Theosophia. So why 18 million years of Theosophia? Does that mean that there is a beginning after all, and thus a certain boundary? No, Theosophia was there before 18 million years ago. It will always be there and will always remain to be there. But that number of 18 million years has to do with the beginning of the awakening of humanity, because that was the time when humanity could first learn about that Theosophia. And we will discuss that further in our lecture next week about the awakening of humanity. Okay, let's start with tonight's topic. The hierarchy of compassion worldwide of all times. Now, we have already briefly introduced Theosophia, but we will elaborate on that a little further to explain the theosophical view of those concepts of hierarchy and of compassion. And then we will deal with the question, what is the hierarchy of compassion? And finally, we will discuss how does the hierarchy of compassion work and what does it mean for us? Now, as I already explained, it works a little different in this second half of the lecture program than you are used to. Instead of a lecture in 3 parts with questions in between, we will do the lecture in full for about 45 minutes, then have a short break of 3 minutes, followed by an interactive study session through Zoom. So if you're not in Zoom right now, but are watching via YouTube, please know that the study session will not be broadcast because of privacy issues, but is open to anyone who signs up for it. So if you haven't already done so, you can email info@blavatskyhouse.org to receive the Zoom link. All right, after this lecture, we will have this short break, and then we will continue the study section via Zoom. And well, if you haven't have the link yet, so that will be the time to do so. It's still safe, gives you enough time. All right. Oh yeah, before I forget, so questions in between, we will also deal with that in the Zoom session. So we do not have time to take your questions that you send in only via YouTube. All right, let's start with this idea of hierarchy. Now, hierarchy has a negative connotation for many people. When most people think of hierarchy, they think immediately of power, of personal power play by bosses, by chiefs, people who will tell you what to do and more or less impose their will on you. And unfortunately, examples abound of these kinds of bosses. And many people unfortunately also still choose these kinds of leaders and then accept that this person determines for them what happens. Freedom is then only limited to what that boss allows. It is the hierarchy based on personal power. And abuse of power is therefore lurking. And power is also not easily taken away. And unfortunately, we see the examples around us every day when we follow the news. Now, on the other hand, we see that hierarchy is a fact of life in nature. And we mean hierarchy based on ability. Steering a ship, cooking in a restaurant, or constructing a building usually goes best when one person is in charge. Someone knowledgeable, experienced, who understands what is going on and what is needed at all levels, and also knows how to connect the different perspectives and interests. So when it comes to social problems or challenges, we prefer to listen to someone who has this larger vision, someone who can inspire us to come to a solution together. So you see that we have, in general, conflicting ideas, conflicting views of this concept of hierarchy. And this is mainly because in ourselves we often still unconsciously have conflicting perspectives. We can see ourselves as a detached individual with his own interests, with just one life, born by chance in a certain time and place with certain characteristics, who, so to say, has to survive in competition with others, or who has to make the best of it. And this view limits us to just our outer personality, in the here and now. But if we look deeper into ourselves, we realize that we all have a sense of belonging, a sense of meaning. We have conscience, we have morals, we have intuition. And you can realize at some point that there is much more to life, that there are broader visions, much wider than what we normally perceive in this outer world on a material level. And Theosophy offers such a wider worldview. Now, what are its central principles? It's a totally different worldview from the mainstream. Because Theosophy assumes not a reality limited to just what we can perceive with our senses, nor assumes just a single span of life, or possibly a subsequent eternal life in heaven or hell, but starts from the most expansive starting point, namely the proposition or principle of boundlessness. And starting from this first principle, we also arrive at a totally different understanding of the concept of hierarchy, and also can deepen the concept of compassion, as we will discuss in this section. Now we can recognize this boundless principle as a simple fact. For example, there is no end to reality. With everything that we can measure to date, we constantly discover new horizons. New perspectives are possible every time. And of course, also each person has their own perspective, and we all hopefully have the experience of expanding our perspectives. Now, infinity or boundlessness as a starting point also leads to the conclusion that there is inseparable connectedness. Everything is rooted in the same boundless principle, for otherwise it would not be boundless. So everything has the same parent, so to speak, and universal brotherhood is thus a fact, not merely a beautiful ideal to be pursued. We are essentially one, and always will be, and separation, every form of separation is just illusory, just as finitude is illusory. But what about this? Because a human life is finite, isn't it? Well, everything is temporary, impermanent, fleeting, if you only look at the outer side of things. Only if you look at the external world that we perceive with our current senses. But boundlessness means precisely that everything we see are just manifestations like shadows, like waves, like temporary phenomena, like memories are, transient. They arise from an underlying force. And that underlying force is a ray of the boundless. And we also call that the monad. Every being is essentially a monad, a spark of eternity, or divine ray of consciousness from the boundless. And very important, that ray or spark manifests cyclically. And that is all that we perceive in the outer world. We mistake the waves of this boundless ocean of consciousness for separate individuals that seemingly appear and disappear. But each consciousness, each monad manifesting, follows ever alternating periods of activity and rest. So a human life is nothing but such a cyclical phenomenon. What we call death is nothing but a period of rest in which the ray of the monad temporarily withdraws for a while to re-embody and continue in its evolution or unfolding after a period of rest. For that is also the third idea, the third core idea, that every being evolves, grows, self-directed, but always in karmic connections with others. I'm sorry, I will show this. So each being, each cycle is nothing like standalone. Just as each wave is composed of countless drops, so each embodiment is a collaboration of countless living building blocks in a hierarchical structure. So each vehicle in turn is composed of living beings in which a higher being evolves, whether it's a star, a planet, a human body, a cell, or an atom. As above, so below. So there's always life within life. And hierarchy and hierarchical structure is thus a fact of nature. So from these principles, let us further see what the meaning of hierarchy is. First of all, what does this word actually mean? Hierarchy comes from the classical Greek hieros, meaning sacred or holy, filled with the divine, and arche, meaning starting point or leadership. A derivation of archein, which means to lead or to be the first. So a hierarchy is something that is led by a hierarch, the first, the leader, the starting point, who is holy, filled with the divine, and who inspires the complete hierarchy. And according to Theosophia, every life, every cosmos has a hierarchy, a starting point, both a summit and a seed, a guiding consciousness, a hierarchy with a certain field of influence. And every life is hierarchically constructed from such a hierarchy. So each life is itself composed of countless gradations of lives, forming layers or spheres of consciousness that pervade each other. So there's life within life, and there are cycles within cycles. Just as we live our lives on this living planet, which is part of the living solar system, which in turn is part of a living galaxy, etc., etc. And so again, we are offering a field of influence within which countless child monads, so to say, embody themselves and go through their many cycles. So we as humans are the hierarchy of the beings that compose our bodies, the cells, the molecules, the atoms. And of course, we then point to the consciousnesses that operate within these building blocks, to which we also refer in Theosophy as life atoms. Now these consciousnesses develop within our field of influence, our own sphere. Hence also the statement, man a microcosm within the macrocosm. And Pythagoras represented this explanation of hierarchy with one symbol, the tetractys. 10 dots in a triangle, and you can clearly see the hierarchy, the apex, the top, which is the field of influence for each of the dots. Each of which in turn represents a being, a child monad, who themselves go through their evolution within that field of influence of the hierarchy. But each of those child monads is also itself a parent monad for these child monads below it. Just as every cosmology begins with the One, which itself has its origin again in the boundless, so you can see this in this tetractys. For example, as the great Chinese sage Lao Tzu says, from the Tao comes the One, from the One comes the Two, from the Two comes the Three, and from the Three comes the 10,000 things. And so this actually applies infinitely. For you can draw or enlarge the tetractys by drawing under each of the dots at the bottom again 2 dots. And below those again, and so on and so on. And also you can imagine that the top itself is actually another bottom dot for a hierarchy above it. So a very powerful symbol that you can study and meditate on for lifetimes to come. Now let's return again for a moment to that field of influence. Now among the leading hierarchies in nature, the field of influence is compassion. Its hierarchy is a being who, out of compassion, halts its own progress in order to inspire all that comes after him in that hierarchy in which he has learned all that there is to learn. And we also call such a hierarchy the silent watcher. We explained this concept in the previous lecture by my colleague Barend Voorhoon. Now the silent watcher is a being who, having become practically omniscient within a particular hierarchy through his evolution, has thus learned everything there is to learn, but nevertheless does not continue his evolution, which would take him to even higher realms of consciousness. Instead, he continues to wait to help the countless less advanced beings who come after him. He remains to perform the task that he himself has undertaken. Waiting, watching, helping, inspiring, and as he does this, seen from our human point of view, he does it in the deepest silence of spiritual compassion. Hence the term silent watcher. So compassion is that guiding field of influence. Now how can we define this compassion when we talk about the hierarchy of compassion? 2 key messengers from that hierarchy of compassion describe it as follows. Madame Blavatsky writes about compassion in her mystical booklet, The Voice of the Silence, the following. She says compassion is not an attribute. It is the law of laws, eternal harmony, a shoreless universal essence, the law of love eternal. I've highlighted a few things to elaborate on that. First, that it's not an attribute. That is, not something you have or don't have. It's always there because we are essentially one. So compassion, thinking and acting from unity, is the expression of what we are in our innermost essence. Saying compassion is an attribute would be as saying that it is an attribute or property of the wave to be connected to the ocean, which of course doesn't make any sense. As there is unity, compassion, thinking and acting from a sense of unity, is something universal. Something that's therefore not reserved only for just a few people. It's something everyone can find in themselves. It is the law of laws. So it's actually the most normal thing there is. The habitual pattern of nature. As we have seen, every hierarchy has a silent watcher, which leads from compassion. And that we have to explicitly name and distinguish compassion as a law actually says more about our current state, our current mentality, that is often still so far removed from it. So someone who is truly compassionate will not expect special appreciation for this. What others may see as a sacrifice is the most natural thing to do for that person. Eternal harmony. If you assume oneness, then every action has an effect on the total, however minimal. And sooner or later that total will also react on the impulse. If you throw a stone into the pond, you will see waves forming, bouncing back from the shore and returning to the place where the stone hit the water. So to act with this law of karma, or law of restoration of harmony, actually means to act in such a way that no restoration of harmony is necessary, cooperating with the eternal harmony of nature. Universal essence. We are in essence thus also always connected to the total. Our deepest universal essence is that total, just as every spark contains the essence of the fire, and every drop the essence of the ocean, or every ray the essence of the sun. And the more we connect with that essence, the more we will then become a source of love eternal ourselves. But this is a different love than what we usually understand by that, such as that from, you could say, the average romantic movie. And that's also what the following quote is about from the fourth leader of the Theosophical Society, Gottfried de Bruycker. His words are that compassion is nature's own heart. For compassion is a form of love, and love is harmony, and harmony is law, and law is the heart of the universe. So it is cosmic love, also called the cement of the universe by the same writer. And as he says again in another place, impersonal love is self-forgetfulness, and personal love is self-worship. Something to think about. Which, by the way, is not to say that personal love is something wrong, but it's just limited. And that love can broaden into more impersonal love, just as you see happen in a good relationship, or in a parent-child relationship. A good parent thinks and acts not only from the interest of its own child. It puts less emphasis on the individual performance of the child, but also looks at how the child behaves in a larger whole, and what responsibility the child takes in, for instance, the classroom. Just as also a good teacher divides his attention among all the pupils. Now we also see the concept of law much wider from the theosophical perspective. Everything is life, everything shares a certain habit pattern, consciously or unconsciously. Think, for instance, about the way we alternate between sleeping and waking. in line with the rotation of the Earth. And these habit patterns, like rotations of planets or the force of gravity, we call laws of nature. But those are just abstractions, because it is in fact about behaviors of beings. And as such, compassion as law is not something outside ourselves, something we just have devised. It comes from the connectedness of all life, how everything responds to everything working from the totality. So compassion can also be described as thinking and acting from a sense of unity, from universal, impersonal love, wisdom, knowledge about the laws of nature. And that it is about thinking and acting means that from our point of view, as human beings, it is therefore a conscious choice. A choice of motive. Are you doing something for yourself or something for the whole, without thinking of yourself? So it is a motive that depends on our degree of identification with the greater whole, the unity of which we are in fact an inseparable part. And that degree of identification, that ability to start from a greater unity in our thinking and acting, that of course can grow on the basis of understanding that unity. And that's why there is no rigid definition of compassion anywhere, because this concept cannot be limited. It's not an attribute. It is in fact about sense of unity, about what we are in essence. And the underlying oneness is boundless, and so our awareness of that oneness will always be growing. And that also means that compassion can develop more and more, just as the scope of our awareness grows. Okay, we have told so far what Theosophy is, and also what the Theosophical perspective means, and what from this Theosophical view are the concepts of compassion and hierarchy, what they mean, what they are based on. We will now turn to the question of what this hierarchy of compassion actually is. But before we do that, we will also dwell a little more on how to recognize the hierarchy in nature. Now, Theosophia teaches us that each planet consists of levels of consciousness, along with different kingdoms of nature in which the monads each learn to express something more of the boundless consciousness. Now, what are these kingdoms of nature? Like every life or plane of consciousness, this planet has a hierarch, a summit, a silent watcher. And that silent watcher completely identifies with that entire hierarchy. So in this case, with all beings belonging to that living planet Earth. And now we can also explain why we call that being silent. Because that being is silent and invisible to at least most of us. For we can only perceive its activity when we have awakened something of that in ourselves. Then we can recognize it and see maybe it's much more active than it shows on the outside. So thus the silent watcher, the top of the hierarchy for almost all beings less developed than him, is for us silent, motionless, as occupied with nothing. Now below the silent watcher there are three distinct realms of what may also be called gods, dhyani choans, or Buddhas. And the great religions and philosophical traditions worldwide in all ages name these types of beings. They give different designations to the realms of beings who are beyond the human level in terms of scope of consciousness. And by the way, Dhyani Choan also means Lord of Contemplation, which, like the silent watcher, is also very telling on how we see these beings. And to us, they are just like sunk in continuous contemplation. Then we have the human kingdom, and below that we have the beast kingdom, the plant kingdom, the mineral kingdom, and also three elemental kingdoms. For even below our level of consciousness, there are countless consciousnesses manifesting in classes invisible to us. And we can recognize the activity of the elemental beings in, for instance, natural phenomena such as light, electricity, or weather phenomena. Now this creates the image of an entire ladder of life, in which each monad can ascend to the level of the silent watcher. Now the realms of consciousness in hierarchy above us are for us self-conscious living expressions of compassion. And we as humans are, as the masters of wisdom and compassion say, the one free agents. Because with our thinking we have the ability to self-consciously direct our actions and can learn to self-consciously cooperate with nature. But because we do not yet recognize these laws of nature sufficiently and do not identify with them sufficiently, we sometimes consciously or unconsciously go against them, by which we karmically create a lot of disharmony, which we will have to repair in future cycles. But actually we are learning to cooperate self-consciously with nature, learning to transform the inspiration of higher kingdoms or levels of consciousness on the mental level. And the kingdoms below us are still in the process of achieving self-consciousness. They are not yet ready to develop the ability to think. They are unself-conscious and unconsciously following the patterns of the higher kingdoms, including ours. And this immediately shows what a responsibility we actually have as humans to either hinder or stimulate the evolution of those less advanced forms of consciousness like the animals and the plants. Now you can divide these kingdoms and actually all living things into two hierarchies. The hierarchy of builders and the hierarchy of light or compassion, which are also called the architects. And the architects lay the pattern that the builders work with. So they also work together continuously. And we too are composed of a spiritual side, think of our monad, and a material side, our vehicle. And these two hierarchies also merge. And moreover, it's relative. What to us is a very advanced spiritual being may be only a builder to a super spiritual being. And this also shows that there is in fact no such thing as evil versus good. Evil is only a matter of relative imperfection compared to the more advanced beings on the spirit side. So actually the holy war that people sometimes talk about in some religion is nothing but the struggle in which the architects are involved that work from compassion to help these imperfect beings come to relative perfection. Now man is actually right in the middle. We are in the process of becoming architects. So we are at a special stage. And therefore we are also these one free agents. For there is no compulsion from the higher realms, only inspiration from compassion. And we can only become a good architect if we learn to work from the same compassion out of free will from our own inner self-guided evolution, so to say. By developing in ourselves the spiritual will and the discernment to be of service to the greater whole. And therefore in this sense we are a freer agent than the divine beings in the realms above us, who work from our point of view completely in line with the laws of nature, in line with compassion. But we are not only at a special stage in general as humans, exactly in between the builders and the architects. Also as part of our evolution we are more or less at the middle stage. And within our human kingdom we have reached the moment in which we can consciously make the choice to work in the line of the hierarchy of compassion. Yes, even to join it. And we then speak of the human department of the hierarchy of compassion, which is also called the Lodge of Wisdom and Compassion. Now what is this Lodge of Wisdom and Compassion? You could say it's the human equivalent of the hierarchy of compassion on Earth. And it consists of those people who consciously choose to work for and through compassion, who attune their thinking to the unity of life and fully master the limited part of themselves. They are those forerunners who have joined each other in one large cooperation. As Gottfried de Brucker says, the great brotherhood of the masters, or Mahatmas, is not an arbitrary institution. It's not an artificial arrangement, which the masters themselves have in different ages brought about in the world. And we know but little of the immense love, the divine impulses of compassion, which sway the souls of those who form this hierarchy of light. They have made the great renunciation. End of quote. So in short, no one has an arbitrary place there. Let us work from the bottom to the top. And thus fortunately in this world we see countless examples of good, selfless people working to improve the world. They are working for an ideal. They are protecting, helping or teaching others and letting nothing and no one stop them. And no matter how much the world opposes them, they always find the strength to keep going and not give up. So these people can be found everywhere, and they are an inspiration to those around them. Now every person who acts compassionately from a selfless motive can thus consciously or unconsciously be a link in this work of the Lodge of Wisdom and Compassion. And if they are this for a longer period of time, or more frequently, and if they voluntarily give themselves up to the ideal of universal brotherhood, then we also call them students on probation, or lay chelas. But a person is really an accepted student, or chela, only when he takes a vow to dedicate his life to the service of humanity. It's someone who has repeatedly proven his ability to serve on a sustainable basis. He will then also meet his master at some point, and his master can train him to go through certain trials. Trials to overcome the lower parts in himself and become more and more a living expression of compassion. Now the teachers, the masters or Mahatmas, have already gone through these trials. They are at home in the inner realms and thus are also the initiators and revelators who can initiate the chelas. And in a sense they allow their students to accelerate their evolution to also become a master so that they in their turn can fulfill a function in the Lodge of Wisdom and Compassion to also protect, heal and inspire humanity. And at the top of the Lodge of Wisdom and Compassion is the Silent Watcher of Humanity, who is also the Silent Watcher of the Earth and is also known as the Mahachohan, the Chief of the Masters, the one who is himself in turn the initiator of the Masters, a being who is the expression of pure compassion for us, and also the wisest human being on earth. Now just as these human examples clearly identify themselves with something much broader than themselves, with humanity or the world as a whole, you can imagine that there are even wider realms of consciousness, beings who have thus also already evolved beyond human consciousness and who identify with life that extends into the cosmic. Thus, for every hierarchy or cycle there is a silent watcher. There is a cosmic silent watcher for our solar system, there is a silent watcher for each planet, there is a silent watcher for each kingdom of nature on that planet, and there is a silent watcher for each evolutionary phase of each kingdom of nature. So during a planet's life phase of 4,320,000,000 of years, there are 7 major evolutionary phases of each hundreds of millions of years. And each of these 7 phases themselves consist also of 7 subphases of tens of millions of years. And each of these phases is thus guided by a silent watcher. And there's even a silent watcher for every human being. Yes, even for every atom. But just as each human being does not express that compassion continuously, So too, as above so below, happens in these larger cycles. During the evolutionary phases and subphases, and also sub-subphases of the kingdoms of nature on a planet, the inspiration is always there, and so is potentially in each of us. But we have to make it active in ourselves, both individually and collectively. And as we know, that of course goes with cycles, with ups and downs. And that's also a matter of development. Depending on the level, we call the silent watchers gods, dhyani, or meaning heavenly Buddhas, dhyani bodhisattvas, bodhisattvas meaning beings who are still one step away from Buddhahood, but who are out of compassion consciously waiting to make that step so they can help others to complete their evolution. Manusha meaning human Buddhas, and Manusha bodhisattvas. Now all silent watchers work together and form this hierarchy of compassion. They can be seen as transformers of the cosmic compassion working through each link in turn, inspiring every phase of life during every life cycle. So then you get the image, as Gottfried de Perucker says, that life is a school, men are the pupils in that school, and in that school there are teachers. And he adds, in these few words you have the key to the whole situation and to the policy of the Great Lodge. Life is a school of consciousness, extending to infinity. So how natural it is for us to raise our own children, to feel the responsibility to educate our children so that they can stand independently in society. You could say this is a reflection of what the beings of higher realms of consciousness are doing to make their wisdom and compassion available to us all. Life is a school, and for every stage, for every class, there is a teacher who gives the students his lessons. And so, under the guidance of the silent watcher of Earth and humanity, there have been impulses of wisdom for millions of years. But in fact, the inspiration is always there. The outstretched hand is there, but we have to grasp it. And that is mainly a matter of mentality. Are we willing to live according to what they have given us over and over again? And of course, in practical life, in daily life, you still see that we aren't really doing that continuously. The lessons are there. If you just look at the golden rule that you can find without exception in every religion, do not do to another what you do not want done to you, or put in positive terms, treat others as you want to be treated, love your neighbor as yourself, then how many of us act this way every day without exception? So the rules are simple, and we all know them. Love, forgive, be fair, be just, speak the truth, forget yourself, be wise, be compassionate. And if we are able to follow this up, we are in fact expressing our own silent watcher and can be an agent, an instrument in the work of the hierarchy of compassion. We will now go to the last part. How do those teachers, how does that school, that lodge of wisdom and compassion, as a branch of the hierarchy of wisdom and compassion in humanity on this earth, how does it work? That's the last question we will consider this section. So for what purpose and how does it work? Simply put, for compassion and through compassion. They recognize universal brotherhood as a fact, have chosen from compassion to dedicate their lives to all that lives, and in doing so they give up their own evolution. But from the lodge of wisdom and compassion they are helped to develop the wisdom they need to fulfill their task. So they are always working together. Thus it is said of the chelas, the adopted disciples of a master of wisdom and compassion, that they must first learn to work together as the fingers of one hand. They must learn to work as a team, as one. And this applies equally to the masters themselves. The foundation of the Theosophical Society arose initially from two masters, who suggested their students, Blavatsky and Olcott, as possible agents and asked permission from their superior for this. And the latter cautiously agreed to the experiment, wondering whether the world was ready for it. Now, several masters were involved from its inception, and many chelas of the same master were also commissioned to support Blavatsky. Now, much was left to the chela's own understanding, and this fits entirely the way of esoteric teaching of the Lodge, that students learn to stand figuratively on their own feet. As one master also writes, brave soldiers need neither orders nor constant encouragement, but inwardly they can always count on support. This is also because the Lodge of Wisdom and Compassion always follows the laws of nature. They work in line with cyclicity and karma and are so-called servants of the law. That means they will never enter into the karma of others, which in fact would only lead to more complicated karma and delay for the restoration of harmony. Now, if two people quarrel, can you solve it for them? No, of course you can't. At best you can mediate, but they will have to shake hands again at some point. Do you help your child by always tying his laces for him and helping him to prevent to fall? No. And this is why the members of the Lodge of Wisdom and Compassion do not impose anything. They do not enforce anything. They just inspire. They do not enforce others by using abilities that they themselves do not yet possess. They only use their powers to protect people from outside forces that we humans do not yet know about. And they try to heal by giving impulses at the right times so that people themselves find the right direction again. They also protect by passing on certain knowledge and abilities only to those who are ready. Because knowledge is power, and this requires discipline. For would an average person be able to always act selflessly? I think even an above average person will have a hard time with that. And only when we are proven, when we are tried and tested to be so, do we deserve more of their knowledge and their help in, you could say, developing certain ability. But you could say they have given us more than enough already, with which we can go forward for lives to come to work on this selfless mentality. And with this we can add another reason why we may not always see or recognize compassion. Because the Lodge of Wisdom and Compassion will thus always respect free will, never impose, but only inspire. So the more we align our will with the spiritual will of these beings, and discipline ourselves to master the selfish in ourselves and replace it with a mindset of selflessness and compassion to serve our fellow human beings, the more we will recognize the work of the Lodge of Wisdom and compassion will become a living reality for us. Now, with all the wisdom given, the members of the Lodge of Wisdom and Compassion also give up their own advancement. For with everything they give us, they also become co-responsible. And this, of course, also gives us, as recipients, responsibility not to use what we receive for our own gain, but to also pass it on and to use it for the common good. The members of the Lodge of Wisdom and Compassion also work by unveiling, by revealing, by initiating. They are, through their development, able to enter more inner planes of consciousness, planes in which we, as average human beings, are still unconscious. such as the planes we go through during sleep or death. The masters are able to remain conscious during these processes, gaining first-hand knowledge and experience from these inner planes. And with this, they can also help others to take their first steps in these planes independently. And this is what takes place during initiations. And finally, the members of the Lodge of Wisdom and Compassion thus function as links of the cosmic hierarchy of compassion. Because even the chief, the leader, the hierarch of the Lodge of Wisdom and Compassion, the Mahachohan, still is a human being. Although seen to us a kind of God-man, a Manusha or human Buddha, the most universal human being we can imagine. And the Lodge of Wisdom and Compassion is a guided structure, which fits into the guided structure of the hierarchy of compassion, which, as we told you, consists of silent watchers and their numerous associates in all fields of life. Silent watchers who each watch and wait until the very end to support each being to complete its evolution in that hierarchy. Aren't these very hopeful teachings? It means we are never alone, that the outstretched hand is always there. But we have to grab it ourselves. The Lodge of Wisdom and Compassion does not operate out of favor. They do not respond to bribes, nor to occasional selfish prayers. The hierarchy of compassion has been the source of continuous inspiration, wisdom, and compassion since the beginning of humanity, for millions of years. They are continuously passing on the Theosophia, the divine wisdom. And Theosophy for the last 150 years has been the embodiment of this inspiration of wisdom and compassion. Now, compassion is something boundless, we have already told you. Something that can continue to grow, and that also means that we can train it, that we can develop it. And it's there when we put ourselves aside, at the service of humanity. And if you do it, you then suddenly begin to experience that you possess unsuspected powers, that you turn out to be able to do more than you ever imagined you could do. You then seem to be an instrument for something greater, an agent in the great work of the hierarchy of compassion. And on every level we can practice compassion by focusing on the greatest whole we can imagine, the broadest, widest unity we can identify with, and working for that, and in that work forgetting ourselves. And if we are able to do that, even if only in isolated moments at first, then we are part of this hierarchy of compassion. Now, it sometimes sounds like a sacrifice when you talk about giving everything for all that lives. But what isn't actually more meaningful than that? What wouldn't be more fulfilling than that? And the more we do that, the more it becomes a habit, becomes part of our character. And the more we will also experience the power of the hierarchy of compassion, and slowly but surely be like a stone in the guardian wall that is formed by this hierarchy of compassion, to which no evil or selfishness can penetrate. Okay, this is what we would like to share on this theme. For the first lecture, we will now have our study via Zoom, which will not be broadcast via YouTube. So I will now end this part by just a short announcement about our lecture for next week. So next week we will continue to discuss a tremendously important event from this hierarchy of compassion, which was the awakening of humanity now 18 million of years ago. Now there are many myths and stories about that. For instance, Prometheus, who stole the fire from the gods, thus igniting the thinking of mankind. But also the story about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, who ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and thus becoming conscious of themselves. Now, what's the significance of these stories? And you could ask, was there one specific moment of awakening of humanity? And what exactly happened? And how can we see that reflected today? Now, we'd love to tell you next week. So now we close, as we always do, with our Gayatri. You could say a call to the most compassionate part in ourselves. That's also the inseparable link in the hierarchy of compassion. O thou golden sun of most excellent splendor, illumine our hearts and fill our minds, so that we, recognizing our oneness with the divinity which is the heart of the universe, may see the pathway before our feet and tread it to those distant goals of perfection, stimulated by thine own radiant light.